fine to me. Um, yeah, uh, I think I am most excited to live in a parsonage when a plumber comes, um, and hands me like a $700 bill for.
Yes, we are getting a new roof this summer, and I don't have to pay for it. So that it's wonderful. I love parsonage life
I'm
when
like,
those
oh,
bills come in.
it's like all you did was replace the spigot on the front patio. like
Wow.
like $700.
They probably charge you 100 more just to show up.
Yeah.
Gotta love living in the DC area. It's wonderful.
All right, so we are here to
You
talk.
boys are back.
Tier, you're in charge.
Well, I
Steer this ship
I first
if you
want to
can.
I first want to say how proud I am of you two for being of sound mind to realize that neither of you could survive an international trip alone. So you had one another there with you.
Todd completes me.
Okay, so for those who don't know, the two of you just got back from.
I mean, the hotel rooms in Turkey. I mean, there is a little Brokeback Mountain kind of. You know, they're twin beds, but they're like 3 inches apart.
Mm. So you just got back from Turkey.
Yes.
Or
or Asia Minor, if you really want to confuse people.
I was going to say Asia Minor, and then I decided not to. But since you just got back from Asia Minor, what were the two of you doing there? Why risk an international incident?
Todd.
We had had a good time when we went to Israel about 3 years ago. And in the spring, Jason saw that Brian was taking a group to Turkey or Asia Minor to um, do a tour of some Orthodox sites as well as some uh, cities that are notable in the New Testament, and said, "What do you think?" And that was it. And so, sort of in the same way that I had never imagined I might go to Israel, I never imagined that we might take a trip like this, but it was good. It was good.
Yeah. I
Both of
concur.
you sound so excited to talk about it.
Well, what would you like to talk about, Tier?
Well, I mean, okay, so so you didn't think you'd ever get to go there. So why Asia Minor? Why Turkey? What's the significance of it for mainline Protestants, for Protestants on the other side of the Atlantic or Pacific, depending on how you get there? Why should we care about this place?
Well, I mean, if anyone has done any work in, you know, discovering the history of the creeds, for instance, the early confessions, these are the places that those were forged. And when we talk about the spread of Christianity, these are the locations that are referred to in Acts, for instance. And then in whatever history you or Jason or myself might have looked at in terms of Christian history, these places can't be avoided.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think we speak of Israel as the Holy Land, and it is. But I think it's wrong to say that Israel is the birthplace of Christianity. It really is Asia Minor. That we forget that on Good Friday Jesus dies as the failed leader of a dead movement.
Mhm.
He's got one disciple and his mother, and everyone else is run away, fled. And as the Book of Acts attests, the gospel put down very shallow roots in Jerusalem and in Israel, and it's Saul being encountered by the risen Christ, and then that compelling the gospel to venture out. Um, that's really where Christianity takes root. And so I don't know that Christians often think of Turkey as ground zero for all the places in their Bible, but it is. So you have Ephesus, where Paul spends the most amount of time. You have the letters addressed by John the Revelator, all right there in the same place. You have Colossae, which is probably the highest Christological statement in the New Testament, is right there. And then Constantinople is, as Todd said, this is where the doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation and the person and work of Christ and Marius Theotokos, like they're all formulated there. And to this day is the Holy See of the Greek Orthodox Church.
Okay, so you two are very well-educated Christians. You've gone to school. I mean, just behind Todd alone are more books than I have behind me.
You can't even see the table filled with books that he has in his office there too.
So many books, and he's read
True.
them all, cover to cover. So, what surprised you? What caught you off guard? What were you not expecting from all of the academic and devotional work you've done within the New Testament in reading about these places versus going there and having your feet, touching the same roads? I remember in Ephesus last September when I was there, just being completely blown away at the layout, the geography, and seeing how day-to-day life operated, and which was something that I hadn't considered in my either New Testament classes or church history classes in seminary. So what were the things that kind of caught you off guard or took your breath away that you weren't expecting?
So I have a number of them. I'll share one, and then I'll let Todd speak. So something that I know theologically, right, is that the real split in the Christian church is not between Catholic and Protestant, but between East and West. That when you look at it, like the Orthodox tradition looks more foreign in a way that the Catholic tradition it looks familiar to most Protestants. And one of those splits is what part of the narrative of Christ you privilege. And so in the West, beginning probably with St. Augustine, the cross becomes the central saving event and an image. And that was not true for the church fathers or the first Christians, and it is still not true for Orthodox Christians. And so so I knew that academically, but I was surprised that we went into all of these basilicas and churches, and that so we saw lots of images, icons of Mary with the Christ child, icons of John the Baptist alongside them, icons of Jesus the cosmic judge, the risen Christ pulling the dead by their forearms out of Hades, and a few Byzantine crosses, but we didn't see any icons of the crucifixion in any of the churches. There are none to be seen. So, the image that is dominant in almost all of our churches, to the extent we have images, was absent.
Did that feel? I'm going to talk about feelings now, so don't get too uncomfortable. Was the absence of that imagery did that make you feel uncomfortable? Did you take a step back? I mean, you just said it was significant to you, but what were you processing as you noticed that change? Because that is a significant change. I mean, here in the we're getting ready to go into Easter, and it's about in Holy Week and Easter, and it's about to be cross resurrection or cross crucifixion central here in the next week or so.
It just I think it's a good reminder to hold your tradition a little lightly. That I think it's good to be aware that we're all part of traditions that maybe for the sake of brevity or communication tend to privilege one aspect of the gospel over another. And it's a reminder that maybe we lose something in doing so. And so it's forced me, like I've been going back and rereading scripture in light of it. And so I just wrote this morning, so that towards the end of Romans 8, Paul says, who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, and who is indeed interceding for us. It's like very clear right there in Romans that for Paul, these are all interconnected events that culminate in Christ's like present tense work of being our high priest. Like he does not narrate these in a way that crucifixion is the central saving act. And so, yeah, it was a good reminder to pay attention to the Bible.
Speaking of paying attention to the Bible, let's shift to the Baptist. Todd, what was the thing for you that stood out or kind of caught you off guard, or perhaps you weren't expecting?
It was a contrast for me when we were at Capernaum. Jason and I talked after that it was noticeable how compact that community was. Peter's mother-in-law's house just down the street from the synagogue, and you weren't very far from the shoreline where surely they put out a boat or two, and so you kind of get this kind of compressed sense. And as a child, you see your map in the back of the Bible, and you understand portion or proportions, and so you think, man, that must be so far away, And then you go and you think, well, maybe all those places are like that, and you hit Laodicea, for instance, the first before we hit even Ephesus, and you stand at the top of the amphitheater that they're rehabbing, and our guide says, he points, I don't know, what seemed like a mile, 2, maybe 3, and said that's where the Hippodrome was and all their sporting events, and there was another, maybe an amphitheater or some kind of coliseum, and we had just come from a church, and you're standing at the top of this what feels like a flat top mountain, or hill, if you will, and it's just spread out. And so in kind of a reverse sense, you realize, wow, this wasn't, a Western where some, itinerant minister is riding into the next small town. This is a real expansive place, and you just don't get the sense of the breadth. And then when you start thinking about when Paul declares the good news, and now you've got it spreading. It's not like maybe he recruited 1 or 2 people, put them on horses, and sent them off to, the north or wherever. But there were lots of people who heard the good news, and then. What's the line in John for this Sunday? There's a line that indicated that there were a group that were coming to hear and see Jesus, and instead of, in contrast to the opponents, and in contrast to those who are rejecting him, and just a lot, and so you kind of get that more expansive sense. And I think it was is urban, more metropolitan in these places. I mean, you knew that about Corinth, for instance. You read the Corinthian correspondence, and you learn about the Isthmian Games and the isthmus used, to move ships to avoid the rocky coasts of the Mediterranean. But I mean, port city. But you don't think of how what the other cities that Paul spent any time or John referred to in the Revelation. So that was one thing.
Were
Yeah.
either of you go ahead, Jason.
Oh no, I was
I'll let you
that again, this is something that I know from book learning, but was that so I mean we tend to speak of it this way still, and it's not true. That early Christianity was an urban movement. That these were dense cosmopolitan cities. It was not a rural movement in the same way that most people in rural areas don't go to church today. The sentimentality we have around that is not correct. Yeah, and specifically at Laodicea, there was a exhibit that kind of denoted what had been listed there at the church in terms of moral expectations for believers and leaders. That I think sometimes Protestants, myself included, speak of the gospel in a way that suggests that Jesus dies in order to free us from the burden of being Christians. And for the first Christians, Christianity was a moral movement, a moral revolution. And they had expectations that couldn't just be dismissed by calling it law, for example. So I think that was important to see. And then I was thinking about it while we were in Istanbul, Constantinople, that we in the West, and in particular in the United States, there seems to be a lot of anxiety about the end of the American empire, the end of the Pax Americana, and a lot of justification for any kind of policies that might forestall that. And so it was interesting to be in a place that was once the center of Christendom, and now is 99% Islamic.
That's what I was going to say is and you hit on it a little bit there, Jason, is that having spent time in Europe and then Asia Minor, I don't think that Christians in North America, particularly American Christians, fully understand just how old the church is, how the history of the church, right? Like you're talking about, the fall of the American Empire. I mean, in the totality of the church, that's less than 300 years of a 2,000-year history. We talk about the totality of, for as old as creation is, we're just a blip on it. And so I think for Western Christians, particularly North American Christians, the fact that we don't understand how old, or we don't appreciate how young we are, or the history on the other side of the water, as it pertains just to humanity, or even with the history of the church, the life of the church. It blows me away sometimes and that took me aback. My church just celebrated its 150th birthday a couple years ago, right? And it's a great celebration. It's a great milestone. Blah 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 blah. But I remember in Ephesus, it's like a chapel or a church of Mary, and there's this big baptismal font, right? That is like solid marble or something, and it has been sitting in that field longer than anybody has ever, white people at least have ever stood on the hill where my church is.
And it's literally the site where Mary was declared Theotokos, which happened so long ago that most Christians in America don't know that it happened. Like,
Right.
you know,
Right.
yeah, it's yeah, I mean, I think too that, like, there's a lot of mainline Christians who speak derisively of Constantine and Constantinianism, and how this was a great accommodation by the church to the evil of empire, and I think there's some historical luxury in being able to do that. That if you were an early Christian, being fed to lions, or wrapped up in wax to be lit for Nero, you probably saw the conversion of the empire as like an act of providence. And even if you weren't a Christian in the Roman Empire, but like one of the, so like Todd and I, so there's like these giant cisterns underground in Istanbul that were just store water in case of sieges. And then like underground cities near Cappadocia that we went to, also where people would retreat at times of so it wasn't like life was bad, and so I can see how the advent of Constantine was seen providentially, in the same way that I think anxiety about the end of American empire reflects sort of a lack of faith in God's providence.
So are you saying that Christians building end of times bunkers is actually in line with the larger history of the church, and not just a new American thing that we're able to sell?
I mean, nuclear fallout shelters were probably not a crazy thing. And maybe they're not again.
Right.
Now that we're forcing Germany to rearm, then maybe they're
Oh,
not a
God.
bad idea.
Okay. So you came back, you were changed by a couple things. It was great. What have you told your congregations, the people you are responsible for pastoring, discipling, about this? If you haven't told them anything, what are you going to tell
Well,
them?
I had to clarify for them that I did not go to Turkey with Elaine Woods, one of my staff members. That is what Peter, my associate pastor, told the congregation the Sunday I was gone. So I had to clarify, no, I didn't run away with a woman on my staff. What about you, Todd?
I haven't mentioned anything in terms of in a large setting, but I have had a few conversations with folks who, of course, wanted to know, did you have a good time? What did you see? That sort of thing. One of our fellows, Charlie, his father-in-law, they cruised the Mediterranean and went to Ephesus, and he was pretty excited. He told Patty while we were gone, "Man, I'm glad he's getting to go see Ephesus." He remembered and he asked, "Did you see X? Did you see Y? That kind of thing." And so I think probably it will work its way in the same way that in conversation or in sermons, there will be a little more vividness to what you can say about context. And so if you're trying to paint a picture, for instance, I thought it was pretty fascinating when we were in Laodicea, and Eunice, who was our guide, made the point that Laodicea got their primarily got a good bit of their water from a town north. I can't remember the name of it, but it was hot springs, and they had this fantastic. This is the other thing that was really crazy. We think we've made such progress and that we're the smartest people that ever lived on God's planet, and then you see that the intricacies of their water systems and such. And so as the water would make its way to Laodicea from its place of origin, instead of being hot, maybe for a thermal bath, if you will, or a hot bath, it was tepid. It was lukewarm by the time it got there. And I don't remember what was Jason may remember. I don't remember what it was about the water coming from the south, and I don't know even how they would get it there. But you get that imagery, and it kind of amplifies that message in a way to say, when you're choosing metaphors. At one time you were, if you will, to borrow the old revivalist language, you're really hot, on fire, if you will, for the Lord. But by the time you get some distance out, you're pretty lukewarm. So I just think that for those who hear those phrases and grew up, say, with early CCM, before it was ever CCM, and they could hear some of those songs about forecasting the end and the apocalypse, and the exhortation to be either hot or cold, lest I spew you out of my mouth. You can add some vividness to some of the things that maybe you couldn't otherwise if you didn't know. These people really weren't dummies. They knew what they were doing, and one of the byproducts of getting a supply that they needed meant that this is kind of how it worked.
And it's funny to think about, like, being a member of the Church of Laodicea and like having to, like it's weird to think about being a member of a church that Jesus talks shit to in Scripture. I mean, it's just kind of funny. And it's funny too that, like, at Laodicea, there was a list of they had listed the books of the New Testament that were canonical, and the Book of Revelation is not one of them. Yeah. So and that's related to the fact too that like Vacation Bible School and Sunday school pictures always portray Paul on a missionary journey in a relatively flat Middle Eastern type setting, right?
Yeah.
When in fact most of Turkey looks like Colorado. So it was, no wonder he stayed in Ephesus for 3 years. He was tired. And also the thing about Laodicea, so it's a reminder too that, like, Paul didn't venture out with something called the New Testament. And what we take to be the New Testament, not all of these churches agreed on what constitutes that. And so it's a reminder to put more emphasis on the promise rather than the text.
Yeah, that was the other thing, that the topography of the place, not just talking about the expansiveness of, say, Laodicea or Ephesus, but we stopped at I don't know, you wouldn't call it a truck stop, but it's a place to use the facilities and to get a cup of coffee or something to drink, stretch your legs on the long bus ride. And you could look up to the south. I'm assuming it was south, and you could see a little snow-topped mountain. And Brad had said, because he was really looking at his map as we went to see a kind of proportion of where we were and where things were, and he said, well, just 15 kilometers over the top of that mountain is Antioch. And so then immediately you start thinking, these guys who preached about the old, hitting the old sawdust trail, if you will, have no idea what they went through to get from one place to another. I mean, they weren't maybe 13ers, but I think we looked it up. It was, 6,000 feet, maybe 6,500 feet. So it wasn't like you just picked up and decided, Forrest Gump it across America on I-40. You really had to, like Jason said, no wonder you spent some time here. It wore you out getting from one place. So I guess I'm trying to say that, they worked. It was exhausting. There was something driving them to do what they did. It wasn't like just, oh, let's go walking. There was some cost. There was some, how do I get from point A to point B? And then you talk about surviving, the elements or opposition, and you go, I could see where I could see where villains might hang out looking for passersby to fleece or to harm, and So anyway, that was a pretty eye-opening feature as well.
And even to like you know push the timeline a couple of centuries. So we went to Cappadocia, which is where Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus and Macrina, their sister, retreated to for monastic life. So there are 6, 7 churches carved by hand out of
Mhm.
stone.
Mm-hmm.
And churches carved by hand in stone with no expectation that other visitors would ever come there, right? And so the level of commitment and the care with which they lavished like fresco images
Mm-hmm.
on the walls of these churches, and the sophistication like I was like, well, no wonder they understand the Trinity so well. Like that, like you've got to be like a geometric genius to just like just to put up a ceiling in here, like
That's right.
I'm like, well, like of course they understand Origin, like they know Pythagoras. And so yeah, and so it was a reminder too that in many ways I think the ancient church was more sophisticated in their Christianity than most believers are today. That we tend to speak, well, even pastors, right, tend to speak of the Trinity as a mystery. And when they say it's a mystery, that means we don't have to talk about it. And, for the church fathers and these early Christians, it was the starting point it was God's name. It's not an add-on. It's an essential starting place.
And it feels like today, and I'll speak for the West, Protestants in the West, our faith is very compartmentalized to a few hours a week, and outside of that, it may affect the way we view our neighbors or the way we engage in politics, but we really don't. For many people, it doesn't carry. There's not a through line from Sunday morning or from a time of worship through the rest of the week, through the rest of their time, with family, with friends, doing whatever they do. But looking to the early church, that compartmentalization that we participate in, it wasn't an option. It was all or nothing.
Or even Todd and I've traveled different places in the world, but this is the first Muslim country that I've visited, and so in the same way that you can't escape the sheer religiosity of Israel, being in a place where you like the call to prayer 5 times a day is unavoidable.
Yeah,
is a reminder of just how secular America is.
I mean, just think about the church I previously served had a bell tower that where like every day at noon, through audible speaker would do some sort of noon bell chime thing, and they eventually turned that off because the neighborhood complained about the noise. Not that it was a reminder of a time of the day, not that it was an act of worship by the church, but it was just annoying. So the church stopped it. I remember from being in Yemen that the call to prayer that 5 times a day. For me, at first, I viewed it as a nuisance because the guys I was working with would stop what they were doing. It didn't matter what we could be in the middle of moving a huge piece of steel and they would stop what they were doing to go and pray. And I just I think that I don't want to say level of devotion, but that practice I think is transformational, and I am envious at times of the early church, and even other religions who have that practice baked into their the DNA of how they're living out their faith, and not just something we might do during Lent.
Well, I I would want to be careful. Uh, I, there is a difference between the appearance of religiosity in a in a in a country that is as secular as America is. Um, I mean, I really got the feeling, frankly, that I was in small town America where there was a church on every corner. And then when Eunice described the level of pious participation in the actual country, um, it was comparable to where we are. And so I think that the move toward a secularism in America in some ways parallels what has happened there, and it's most likely facilitated by the very religions of both countries.
Hmm.
And so when those practices are more trivialized, then I think that's how we arrive at where we are in our own country, where these practices that you're describing, someone in a different country, of course, being much more fastidious about their expressions. Um, I just think there's more comparable illustrations than distinctions. And I think the secularity is, I think Eunice actually made that point in talking about how that worked. And it's just a matter of, we may have arrived at it a different way here, but it's very similar.
Yeah.
In other words, I don't want to valorize something that actually in its reality is not much different than where we are.
Yeah, I hear that.
It reminds me of somewhere Stanley Hauerwas writes, about being in Ireland, and he's just like, well, if this is what Christendom is, I kind of like it.
Yeah, we were walking from the harbor back to the hotel, Brad and I were, and we were talking about some of the things we had heard, and we were talking about separation of church and state, for instance, and how that is, kind of regularly in our news cycle, the tests and such, particularly here in Oklahoma, and I think probably throughout the country. And a lady was walking near us, and she overheard our conversation. And Brad made a remark. He said something like, "Well, this really hasn't been tested, but it's about to." And she turns to us and says, "Well, you better hope it doesn't turn out like it did here."
Yeah, I mean, it was helpful to learn that. So all the imams in Turkey are government employees, for the purpose of moderating Islam, which is so it functions in the same way that the establishment of Christianity in Europe. There's not a lot of right-wing Christianity in Europe.
No, but that's, I mean, if we're going to take, if we don't want to probably delve into politics too much, but if we take the trajectory that some want to go, that's why I say that we're on the same path to a sort of secularization that we've warned against for my lifetime, and yet we're going to be the very group that actually ensures that it happens.
Well, Cody has been with us for this conversation, and so he recommends.
I didn't know we had any guests.
Yeah, so he's been very thoughtful this whole time.
Yes, he has.
So yeah, I have not read "Surprised by God" by Chris Green, but I will check that out. Yeah, and he's echoing your point, Todd, about piety, the appearance of piety versus actual contemplation. Yeah, I was, so we were in, was it St. George's Church in Istanbul, which is for lack of a better analogy, it's the Vatican of the Greek Orthodox Church, even though it's an incredibly tiny ordinary
Incredibly.
church. Like once you get kicked out of the Hagia Sophia, he like,
Yeah, right.
they're like, that was paid for. Now we got to pay rent. But yeah, so there were, and I remember this. This was true in Thessaloniki when Ali and I were there. So there were people coming in to pay homage to some of the relics. There was a relic of Gregory of Nyssa in that church, and it's a reminder, I think, that if you de-emphasize incarnational theology and you de-emphasize the doctrine of the Trinity, and you make Christianity just something in your head, or make Jesus just a teacher long ago in a Galilee far, far away, in effect, you desacralize creation. That I think, in those parts of the world where the Eastern Church has a footprint, a bigger footprint, it's the importance of sacred places and sacred objects as extensions of the incarnation. I think that's a good reminder of not making Christianity purely a head matter or a heart matter.
Yeah.
So where are you two going next?
I mean,
are you going to walk the Camino together? Are you going to go?
I mean, we got to do some sort of, I mean,
where are you going next? The people are going to want to know.
Yeah. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? I have no idea.
I mean, pilgrimage is a good spiritual practice, right?
Okay, so tell us why. Why? Because we don't live in the three of us, at least I know, don't, from my own experience of Methodism, we don't come from a tradition of pilgrimage that encourages it, that helps facilitate it. We're more adept to facilitate, bureaucratic forms and reports that nobody's ever going to read than pilgrimage.
I mean, I guess
for Todd, but I know our corner of Christianity.
I think, I guess one way to answer that would be that if you are concerned about the politicization of the faith in America, a good antidote to that is to get out and acquaint yourself with the global body that is the church. Historic global body. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it has helped. These two trips that we have taken have been helped because Brian frames them as pilgrimages. So, instead of we're going to go tour Israel or we're going to go tour Asia Minor, for instance, there is an aim. There's an intended focus. So conversations, discussions, sides, for instance, when Brian wants to stop at Pergamum and talk for 10, maybe 15 minutes about some feature of where we're sitting and where we've been. It's not just to say, well, here's when this city was built and here's when it was overrun and here's maybe when an earthquake happened, for instance, or something along those lines. He focused attention really on what's the meaning of this particular place, why is it referenced, what's its value, what do we take away, and they weren't long sermons. I mean, I'm not sure he was 15 minutes at Pergamum, for instance, but I think that helps to kind of locate what Jason's describing as here's kind of the historical markers, and so that when you in sort of a silly sense hear as if the colonists discovered Christianity in America and so formed their constitution accordingly, that would sound like the narrative, and you're like, wait a minute, this goes way back. This is something like you're talking earlier. I think pilgrimage is a good metaphor, a good picture, because you're thinking about what you're doing, and instead of you know how many places can I see? What am I seeing along the way?
Yeah.
Well, I like the way you frame. I mean, I've never traveled with Brian's on, but I like the idea of it being framed in a way that has a purpose beyond relaxation, beyond seeing something neat. The kind of the reasons why we go on vacation.
Listen, we put in some steps, and we put in some very steep steps. So if this were like leisure, they needed a trolley to get this old man up the hill some days. So it was not, you know, it was not some simple, walk paths from here to there. It took something.
When you were in Ephesus, did you start at the top of the hill and work your way down?
We started, I think, at the entrance when you come in the gate, and there's the Roman bath there as you kind of head straight through the turnstile, and there's the Roman bath, and then they've got the big model of the city.
Yeah. I just remember walking down this really steep hill.
Yeah, we did.
In Ephesus, just thinking,
Todd headed straight for the House of Pleasure. She's like, I'm going. Maybe someone still works there.
I forgot to take off my shoes though and see if my feet fit in the little cutout to make sure you're old enough.
Well, guys, it's been delightful.
Yes.
I'm happy you're back. I'm happy you made it back. I'm not gonna lie, I was a bit worried about one of you.
Well,
and I'm glad Todd was there to make sure nothing happened.
It was a team effort. We helped each other, and that's what
I just
always
remember
works.
the first time you two traveled to get to the same city. Jason was almost arrested. So I'm just happy that nothing happened this time.
Oh, thank you. I will press stop. All right.
Good
Well,
job.